She came to the wild valley to build a cabin with her bare hands and leave the world behind. But what she didn't know was that a quiet cowboy watched from the ridge each day. A man who carried his own silent storm of grief and dreams long buried. And as her walls rose from timber and willpower, something else began to rise to, a connection neither of them expected. And a love that would test their strength more than any mountain wind could have. You are new to the channel, then please subscribe to the channel and like the video and tell us where are you watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The valley lay quiet under a late summer sun that poured amber light across the open meadow. Grass swayed in long sleepy waves, and high above the river, a line of evergreen trees whispered in the warm breeze. Through this hush rode a lone wagon, driven by a woman who carried more resolve than baggage. Her name was Mira Dalton, and she had come to claim a patch of wild land where she could breathe without the noise of the past. She stepped down, boots sinking into the soft earth, and tilted her head as if listening for a welcome only she could hear. Mira was 30 seasons in age, slim yet sturdy, with hands that showed both calluses and care, every scar across her. Knuckles was a quiet signature from work done the honest way. She had left a restless town behind because its crowded streets echoed with memories that cut too sharply. Her grandmother's letters had spoken of this hidden valley as a place where the sky felt near and the stakes felt far. Now Myra wished to build not just a house but a life, one log at a time, a place where each joint and being would remind her that hope is stronger than regret. She unpacked tools wrapped in oilcloth, a weathered adze, a bright axe, a square, and a rope. Each had belonged to someone she loved. Each carried a lesson harder than iron. Mira marked the first pine log with charcoal, lined her cut, swung the axe, and felt the steady thud travel through her arms into the earth. Birds startled from branches. Yet she did not pause. Rhythm formed with every swing. Chips flew. The log's pale heartwood shone. Sweat rolled down her cheek and vanished in dust, but her eyes stayed bright. She hummed a tune older than herself and stacked the trimmed log on skids. Higher on a bluff across the river sat Callan Reed, reins loose in one hand. He watched as the tiny figure below shaped timber from raw forest into neat lengths. Callan did not plan to spy. Yet day after day his horse grazed the same trail while his heart pulled him to the same overlook. Something in the woman's fierce style of work caught him. He had seen strong folks quit at lesser tasks, but she pressed on beneath a golden sun or bruised sky alike, and though he was a patient man, he felt an impatience growing, a wish to speak, to help, to know her name. Callan was 38, a widower by fate and a rancher by trade. 5 winters earlier, a fever had taken his wife along with the unborn future they had imagined. Grief had turned his ranch house into a hollow frame, so he sank himself into livestock and fences, choosing silence over sorrow. Time slowed there. Yet even time can be startled by a stranger. Since Myra's arrival, he felt his heart waking the way a cold muscle warms beside a fire. He found himself noticing color again, the purple spray of lupin, the copper flicker of a hawk's wing. It puzzled him, but he did not fight it. Each evening the sun slid behind peaks and painted the valley in honeyed bronze. Mira stacked another log and stepped back to study her progress. The cabin footprint was small yet tidy, corners notched with care, but one beam lay stubborn on the ground, thicker than the rest, too heavy for her leverage. The problem teased her patience. She tried a pulley, a ramp of rough planks, even a pair of fence posts for rolling. Yet the beam only shifted, mocking her labor. Still she refused to say defeat. Her breath came slow. Her shirt clung damp too. Her shoulders, the sky deepened from blue to violet around her. On the ridge Callan felt the air cool and knew night would soon erase the scene. When Mira stooped once more to the stalled beam, a pang of empathy moved him past his boundary. He guided his horse down the slope, hooves soft on loam, nerves louder. Then hoofbeats. Each stride closed the distance between watcher and worker. And with each stride he rehearsed a greeting that would not wound her pride. Mira wiped sweat from her brow, straightened, and placed both palms on the stubborn beam. Moonlight had begun to pool along the river when a low, respectful voice drifted across the quiet. "Excuse me, ma'am." The words were gentle, carrying no judgment, only intent. Mira spun. Her heart thumped against worn fabric. Before her stood a tall horse and a taller man. His hat held lightly in his hand. The brim left his face open, kind. Eyes watched hers, no laughter in them, just steady calm. She said nothing. Callan stepped closer, yet kept a fair space. "I wondered if I might lend a hand." He spoke as softly as evening wind through pines. Mira glanced at the beam, then back at him. Silence hung like a held breath. She measured the man. Saw weary lines at his eyes, saw honesty in the way he waited. Not one muscle pushed. Finally, a small smile ghosted across her lips as she gave a single nod. Callan's own grin warmed the dim light. And so under the first shy stars, the two strangers bent over the heavy timber together. 4 hands upon rough bark, they counted, lifted, slid the beam into its notch. The log settled with a muffled thump that echoed through the valley. Mira exhaled, relief curling into gratitude. Callan tipped his hat again. "May I ask your name?" she answered. "Mira Dalton, and you?" "Callan Reed," he said, "neighbor from the north side river bend." They shook hands. Callan mounted his horse. "Shall I ride by tomorrow to check on your progress?" "Only if you bring the sunrise with you," Mira replied without thinking. Surprise flickered across her face at her own boldness. Callan chuckled. "I'll see what I can do." He wheeled his horse and started up the ridge. Mira watched until horse and rider blurred into night. A new spark glowed inside her. Gentle yet potent, she placed her hand upon the beam they had raised. Felt the pulse of shared effort in the hush left behind. Crickets sang. River water murmured over stones. The half-finished cabin stood taller against the starfield. And somewhere between the logs and the limitless sky, a quiet promise began to take shape, a promise that neither Myra nor Callan could yet name, but that both would soon learn had the strength of the very mountains that watched over them. The sun climbed slow over the ridge the next morning, bathing the valley in pale gold and waking Myra with a hush of light through canvas curtains. She had strung in the open frame of her half-built cabin. Her muscles ached from yesterday, yet the ache carried pride rather than pain. She stepped outside and breathed air that tasted like pine and promise. She did not expect company so early, but as she swung her axe for the first cut of the day, she heard hoofbeats rolling soft like distant thunder, then rolling close like a heartbeat in her ear. Callan Reed appeared at the meadow edge, leading his horse by the reins instead of riding. The gesture told Mira he came not as someone above her work, but as someone beside it. He lifted a small basket from the saddle and raised it in greeting. "Fresh bread and a jar of honey made at my place north of the river bend. Thought you could use a solid breakfast." His tone was plain as water and twice as welcome. Mira set her axe aside, wiped sawdust from her palms, and accepted the gift with a nod that carried thanks too large for words. They ate on an overturned stump that served as a rough table, each bite of warm bread coated with sunlight-colored honey. An easy calm settled between them like a blanket nobody wove yet both could feel. Callan asked permission before offering advice on the next beam, and Mira noticed he spoke in gentle suggestions, never in commands. When she agreed, he knelt and showed her a brace not his father had taught him back when Callan himself was barely taller than the rope. The knot would keep the ridgepole from shifting under snowfall. Mira practiced the loop and tuck until the motion felt like her own idea. Hours passed in a rhythm of swing and lift, haul and laugh. Mira handled the adze with swift accuracy, shaving edges smooth. Callan steadied the long logs while she worked, then he hewed notches under her watchful eye. They traded roles as the day grew warmer, and each trade felt like the silent promise of respect. Clouds drifted overhead, casting roaming shadows on the meadow, yet never stealing its brightness. By noon they had raised 2 sidewalls to shoulder height. Pine scent lingered sweet and resin-rich around them. The cabin outline now resembled a home rather than a sketch on soil. During a brief rest, Callan asked about the compass rose carved into Myra's axe handle. She traced the lines with her thumb and explained it had belonged to her mother, who dreamed of sailing oceans yet never left dry land. The compass now traveled only through forests, but its meaning was the same: find your way. Callan listened as if her words were precious stones. In return, he spoke of quiet evenings on his ranch, where wind moved through empty rooms louder than voices. Myra recognized the hush he described, because she too knew a hush that weighed heavier than sound. Her gaze softened, yet she said nothing, giving his story the space to unfold without hurry. Later, when the sun bellied out in the western sky, a stubborn beam refused to sit flush in its notch. Myra frowned, recalculating angles, while Callan fetched a wedge from his pack. Instead of solving the issue alone, he offered the wedge and waited. She considered the beam, then signaled him to tap the end while she levered the far side. Their timing proved perfect, and the wood slipped into place with a solid, satisfying thunk. Both grinned at the same instant, a grin shared and stored away like seed grain ready for some future season. A breeze cooled the sweat on their necks as evening slid across the land. Birdsong thinned into twilight silence until only the river murmur remained. Myra set down her mallet and faced Callan. You never said why you took time from your ranch to help a stranger build walls. Callan brushed sawdust from his sleeves and stared north, where the mountains darkened against dusk. His voice dropped to a hush so gentle the valley might have leaned closer to hear. Sometimes solitude feels safe until you notice it is swallowing every color around you, he said, and sometimes a stranger swinging an axe under morning light looks like a road back to living. Myra absorbed his words like timber absorbs stain. Her heartbeats landed quicker now, but she kept her face calm. She sensed sorrow under his calm surface, the way one senses deep water beneath thin ice. She guessed that sorrow named his wife, even if he never spoke her name aloud. She wanted to ask more, yet also feared trespassing on ground that was not yet ready for footsteps. Instead, she nodded once, a nod carrying both understanding and invitation. Callan matched her nod, as though accepting a contract neither had written. In ink, dusk wrapped them in purple and copper glow. Callan gathered leftover wood scraps and stacked them neatly by the cabin wall. Myra extinguished the small cook fire and covered embers with soil. They worked in silence, yet the silence felt alive, not empty. When tasks were done, Callan untied his horse and paused with reins in hand. May I come again tomorrow, only if you bring more honey? Myra teased. Callan's grin flashed. I reckon I can manage that, he replied. He mounted smoothly and guided his horse toward the ridge, but stopped halfway, turned in his saddle, and spoke words that floated downward like soft feathers. Silence can speak louder than sorrow, but shared silence can heal it. Then he rode on, leaving hoofprints that caught starlight like silver coins scattered on dark earth. Myra watched until the rider was only a shadow merging with larger shadows. She pressed a palm to the new wall, astonished by how solid it felt beneath her fingers. She whispered a promise to herself that this cabin would hold not only her dreams, but any light brave enough to enter. Somewhere above her, a lone owl called, and the answering hush sounded less like emptiness and more like breath drawn in before a song. Myra smiled at that thought, a quiet smile meant only for the night air. Then she stepped inside the framework, where moonlight striped the floor, and felt the shape of tomorrow settle around her shoulders like a cloak sewn from hope. Soft fog wrapped the valley at dawn, drifting low against pine trunks while Myra Dalton stacked kindling at the hearth. Her breath puffed white in the chill, each puff a small promise that the new roof would soon shelter steady warmth. Outside, dew clung to half-finished rafters like tiny lanterns. She heard hooves crunch frost, and Callan Reed appeared leading 2 sorrel mares. He lifted a basket full of fresh eggs and a cheeky grin. Myra answered with a nod that was half hello and half I was waiting. Breakfast cooked fast over oak coals. The pan hissed and the aroma of sizzling eggs carried across the clearing. They ate from tin plates and planned the day. Callan traced lines in the dirt, explaining how angled braces would tie the rafters together like fingers interlaced. Myra listened, then added her own sketch. A window seat tucked under the eaves, wide enough for stargazing. Their plans overlapped like quilt squares, making something warmer together than either would alone. The morning sky brightened into a clear blue bowl. They raised rafters in a steady rhythm that felt almost like music. Callan lifted heavy timber. With rope and pulley, Mira guided each beam into place, her voice firm yet gentle, her instructions met with his easy, "Yes, ma'am." She laughed and told him to drop the ma'am. He laughed back and called her boss instead. The cabin frame rose higher, blocking the sun in graceful angles. Squirrels chattered approval from nearby branches. By midday, they rested near the river, shoes off, toes in cold water. Callan watched sunlight dance on the ripples and let words spill in a low tone. He spoke about the night the fever swept through his home like a thief, how he buried dreams beneath the cottonwoods beyond his pasture. Mira listened without flinching, her fingers drawing circles in wet sand. She did not hurry him, sorrow needs room, she knew, and she offered that room with silence and steady eyes. When his voice fell quiet, Mira shared her own scar. A story of city nights filled with skyscraper glare and tires screeching at every corner. A father who wanted her to sit behind an office desk instead of crouch over fresh-cut timber. A fiancé who called her stubborn when she refused, she told Callan how the noise outside had slowly become the noise inside. Until she could not hear herself breathe, the valley, she whispered, was the first place she heard her own heartbeat again. Afternoon shadows lengthened, and they walked back to the site with lighter souls. Callan showed Mira how to cut a bird. Mouth joint for the ridgepole, she matched his movements, then joked she might outpace him soon. Callan's smile spread slow and proud. Together they hoisted the ridgepole, balancing its weight in perfect harmony. 2 hands here, 2 hands there. Every motion proof that partnership can be quiet yet powerful. The ridge settled true, and a cheer escaped them both, rolling across the meadow like thunder softened by distance. Clouds gathered in lavender swirls as the sun lowered. Mira stirred a pot of stew while Callan fashioned temporary shutters to guard against the coming night. Breeze. They ate side by side on the new porch step, knees almost touching. Stars pricked the sky. Callan reached into his coat and revealed a small jar of berry jam, made from last summer's harvest. He handed it over without a word. Mira accepted with a smile so bright it rivaled the rising moon. Gratitude pulsed between them, warm and gentle. After supper, Callan fetched his guitar. The instrument weathered like his voice, and strummed a slow waltz. Mira leaned against a post and let the melody unfold. Notes drifted upward, mingling with pine scent. She closed her eyes and pictured the cabin finished. A table set for 2, laughter echoing under the beams they had lifted today. The vision startled her with its clarity. When she opened her eyes, she found Callan watching her, the song still ringing low, a question shining in his look. Mira rose and walked to the doorway where open sky framed a home not yet complete. She touched the ridgepole and spoke soft enough that the wood might be the first to know. I came to build walls so I could stand alone, but these walls feel too wide for one heart. Her confession hung like mist glowing in moonlight. Callan set his guitar aside and stepped closer, a respectful distance still between them. He did not answer with grand phrases. Instead, he placed his palm against the same timber and whispered, "Sometimes a beam finds its strength by resting against another." The night settled deep, crickets tuned their chorus, and the nearly finished cabin glowed silver under the stars. Callan gathered his hat. Mira walked him to his horse. Neither wished to break the hush blooming around them, yet parting was gentle. "May I return at dawn?" Callan asked. "Only if you bring the sunrise again," Mira replied, her smile now a secret shared by the moon. He swung into the saddle, tipped his brim, and rode toward the ridge, hoofbeats fading slow, leaving echoes shaped like hope. Mira looked up at the new roof silhouetted against the sky. She laid a hand on the doorway where 2 sets of fingerprints smudged the fresh-cut wood. She felt the cabin breathing with possibilities. Inside her chest, the same breath rose. And in that quiet moment, she knew they were building far more than walls. First light sifted through the pine tops in pale threads of silver. Frost glazed every blade of grass and made the meadow glitter. Inside the nearly finished cabin, Mira Dalton wrapped her hands around a steaming mug and watched her breath curl. Like smoke, Callan Reed stood beside her with a toolbox balanced on one hip. They shared a quiet grin that spoke of backaches earned and milestones passed. Today they would drive the last nail and turn an empty shell into a living heart. A task. Both ordinary and holy, they began with the front door. Callan steadied the cedar slab while Myra eased the iron hinges into place. When the latch clicked home, it sounded like a bell ringing in a distant church. Next they fastened the shutters painted the warm green of summer hills. Through the open window drifted the scent of sawdust mixed with cold morning air. Mira traced a finger over the final joint in the frame, feeling the grain beneath her skin. Callan said nothing yet, his eyes shone bright as sunrise, a look that told her he saw not wood but possibility. Midday found them side by side on the newly laid plank floor, arranging a braided rug Mira had woven from scraps of fabric. Callan fetched a small cedar chest he built in secret. Inside lay a quilt stitched with stars. He unfolded it and spread it across the bed platform. Mira's breath caught. She read the story sewn into every square. Grief transformed into constellations, hope. Rising like dawn, she lifted her gaze and met his. Callan cleared his throat, yet the words spilled true. I thought my heart would never house joy again. Then you walked into this valley, and the walls of my silence cracked wide open. Mira took his hand, feeling the roughness of his work and the tenderness beneath. She answered in a whisper softer than snow. I came here to prove I needed no one. Instead, I found that being strong can mean letting someone share the weight. Their silence filled with the hush of wind through pine needles. Then they stepped outside where the afternoon sun melted the last frost. Together they planted 2 young apple trees on the south slope. Callan dug while Mira set each root carefully into the earth. When they finished, Callan pressed a kiss to her dirt-streaked cheek, the gesture as gentle as new leaves unfolding. News of the wedding spread by word of mouth faster than any mule could travel. On the first warm day of spring, neighbors rode in from distant ranches. They gathered in the meadow where purple lupin pushed through thawed soil. Mira wore a dress the color of milkweed fluff, Callan a clean white shirt and a borrowed tie. The ceremony was brief yet felt timeless. Vows spoken in voices steady as river stones. A single fiddle sang while meadowlarks provided harmony. When the couple exchanged rings fashioned from hammered silver, the crowd cheered and hats flew skyward like brown birds escaping. Dinner was stew served from cast iron kettles and bread baked by half the valley's grandmothers. Laughter rolled long after twilight painted the mountains blue. The first snowfall of their married life drifted soft and lazy. Inside the cabin a fire crackled. Callan read aloud from a tattered book while Myra mended a work glove. The room smelled of pine resin and fresh bread. Every corner glowed golden. They shared small stories, the kind that seem unimportant until you realize they stitched 2 lives together better than any thread. Outside, snow piled on the roof, but the rafters held firm, just as they had planned, each timber resting against another, proving Callan's quiet truth. A beam finds its strength by leaning. Seasons turned steady, the apple trees grew tall, pink blossoms each spring and red fruit each autumn. The cabin weathered but never wavered. Its walls darkened by rain and brightened by sunlight. Travelers passing through were offered coffee and stories. Mira and Callan's tale traveled farther than either expected. Some called the place the house Hope built. Others simply called it home. Every guest left with a jar of honey or a slice of pie and a lighter heart, because the air around the cabin carried calm like fragrance. One bright summer evening a young couple arrived, their truck thick with city dust. They stepped shyly onto the porch, holding hands tight as lifelines. They told Mira and Callan that they were searching for land and courage to build a life from scratch. Mira poured cool water from a stoneware pitcher and listened while cicadas sang. When the tale of doubt and dream finished, she spoke in her gentle valley voice. I shaped these walls with my hands, yet the space inside them grew wider the day I opened the door to help. Love is built the same way, one careful board at a time. Measure twice, forgive often, and never be afraid to ask someone to steady thee. Other end, Callan added his own wisdom, his words as steady as the beams overhead. Grief may carve deep hollows, but those hollows can hold new laughter if you let them. Build with humility, roof your days with gratitude, and leave windows for light to enter, even on dark mornings. The young couple thanked them and left with apple saplings and newfound resolve. Dusk settled lavender across the meadow. Mira and Callan sat on the porch steps, their shoulders touching. They watched fireflies appear like sparks from an unseen forge. The cabin behind them breathed with evening wind and whispered its own story. Boards and nails and two hearts that dared to believe broken things can be made whole in that soft glow. The builder and the cowboy shared a promise without speaking, to guard the love that built their home just as carefully as they once guarded the rising walls. And the valley listened, and the stars kept watch.